economic institutions of the European Union. During the so-called Eurozone crisis of the 2010s, for instance, when many European countries were tottering on the brink of bankruptcy, Germany was the nation usually framed as managing the continent's economic recovery strategy, even exerting borderline receivership over places like Greece. A lot of this, too, was seen as being bound up in the country's post-war mindset, wherein Germany's history of abusing its neighbors assigns them moral obligation to help them in times of crisis, though of course German help isn't always well received. Domestically, we think of Germany as having somewhat placid politics, a stable democracy on guard against any sort of political extremism, again for the obvious historical reasons. Chancellor Angela Merkel, a moderate conservative who has been in power for 15 straight years, being a leading symbol of this. I would say the German domestic controversy that's best known abroad involves the issue of economic inequality, particularly the economic and social divides that still alienate Western Germany from the East, which of course was an independent country from 1945 to 1990, as well as the division between native-born Germans and immigrants. Germany actually has the fastest growing immigration population of any G7 country, in part because non-discriminatory immigration is yet one more way the country is said to be overcoming the legacy of the Third Reich. Alright, after Germany, let us talk about Canada, the country where I live. Canada is the smallest member of the G7, and its inclusion in the group was said to be done at the explicit request of US President Gerald Ford, who wanted a strong US ally in there to balance out all the Europeans. That unto itself says a lot about Canada, which is a country very similar to the United States and very firmly in the American economic cultural orbit. Canada does the vast majority of its trade with the United States, and the two countries are probably among the most indistinguishable on Earth. But this closeness has always fostered a great deal of Canadian anxiety and an ongoing Canadian obsession with demonstrating difference from and superiority to America. Some of this plays out in the foreign policy realm, where a certain sort of Canadian really likes this idea of Canada being a more moderate, conciliatory country than the US, one very happy to work through multilateral institutions in a kind and selfless manner. As Prime Minister Trudeau once told the UN,
"But we're Canadian, and we're here to help."
But that said, on most of the big questions, Canada's foreign policy is quite similar to America's, in part because Canadians share a lot of the same basic cultural and moral assumptions. Canada was an active participant in the US-led war against radical Islamic terrorism. The country is a strong supporter of the State of Israel, and Canada shares many of America's anxieties about the rise of China. Internally, Canada is a very diverse country, with the most famous drama of its diversity coming from tensions between its population of English speakers and French speakers. However, these days I would say that is a much less front-of-mind concern than it used to be, and is now mostly confined to beefs between YouTubers. And speaking of the French, let us now go to actual France. France used to be one of the world's great imperial powers, and that history has helped keep France a very outward-facing country to this day. The fact that France used to run much of North Africa in particular has kept that region a big part of both foreign and domestic politics in France, even now. The French are known for their pride, and a lot of French people do hold at least some residual affinity that some aspects of their culture remain present in Africa. French presidents, accordingly, often make a big deal about upholding the bonds of the so-called Francophonie community, which includes a lot of military support and even a French willingness to intervene militarily in its former colonies now and then. But on the other hand, the brutalities of French colonialism in Africa have fostered an ongoing legacy of resentment towards French people that can often be quite unlike anything else. I remember once hearing an interview with Christopher Hitchens where he was talking about visiting the countries of Northern Africa, and he said that one thing you learn very quickly as a white person in that part of the world is to always tell everybody that you're not French. But in any case, ongoing interest in Africa is but one manifestation of this long-standing idea that French foreign policy must be distinctly French, and particularly distinct from whatever the British and Americans are doing. France famously pulled out of NATO's military command structure in the 1960s because it was seen as a threat to French sovereignty, and they only recently rejoined amid much controversy. And of course, the French were very vocally opposed to the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq in 2003. France's former empire has also been responsible for much of the ethnic diversity that characterizes modern France, especially Paris. North Africa remains the largest source of the country's steadily growing immigrant population, which has in turn also been the source of a lot of well-known racial and religious strife in the country. This tension is often framed as being a very particularly French thing, and is often attributed to the idea that the French have unrealistically high expectations of assimilation. But in many ways, domestic tension over immigration is one thing that pretty much every G7 country shares. Way on the other side of the world, we have the nation of Japan, the only Asian member of the G7. Japan is a country with a lot of similarities to Germany in some ways. Its crushing defeat in World War II also created a powerful consensus that the country should embrace a pacifist foreign policy forever, and instead exercise its global influence through the strength of its economy. In some ways, Japan has historically gone even further than Germany, getting closer to outright isolationism, where the country's government rarely even expresses firm opinions on foreign policy debates. We don't ever really think of Japan as a country that has much to say about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, for instance. However, in recent years, there's also been a growing sense that as China becomes more powerful, Japanese foreign policy should become more aggressive in asserting its interests in the Pacific, particularly under the recently departed Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who's been described as Japan's most powerful and nationalistic leader since the war. There has been increasing talk about Japan ditching some of the pacifist provisions in its constitution that limit the way it can use its military. Japanese domestic politics are probably the most tranquil in all of the G7. Japan is in fact often described as being an almost sort of pseudo one-party state. Given that their elections are not very competitive, the same party almost always wins, and they don't really have a culture of the same sort of aggressive political debate you see in other places. That can be attractive, of course, but it's also often interpreted as a symbol of Japanese apathy and stagnation. As we all know from watching Back to the Future Part 2, there was a time when Japan's economic might was so strong, it seemed plausible to believe they could someday take over the entire world.
Fujitsu-san, konnichiwa!
McFry! I was monitoring that scan you just interfaced. You are terminated!
But as you can see from this chart, since the 1990s, Japanese economic growth has been pretty lackluster, which is often blamed on a decline of Japanese innovation and creativity. But that said, a big surprise since the 1990s has been the amount of cultural influence Japan has accumulated, which, as we shall see, can be a very important source of global power as well. Which brings us to the good old USA. And what is there to say here? America is the richest country in the world and also the most powerful militarily. Like the main character in a sitcom, pretty much everything important that's happened over the last few decades has revolved around it in some way. American foreign policy has traditionally been very righteous and moralistic, which comes out of America's revolutionary tradition of seeing itself as a place founded to defend liberty and democracy.
We shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
This, in turn, can make it very easy to criticize American foreign policy, since it sets such high standards for itself. The constant growth of American military power after the end of World War II has made it easy for the US to intervene as it sees fit in countries all over the world, staging invasions and overthrowing governments. But pretty much everyone seems to agree that America's track record of success with its interventions has been pretty hit and miss. The American war in Vietnam during the 1970s and the American war in Iraq during the 2000s in particular are now leading symbols of how America's moralizing military crusades can easily descend into morally ambiguous quagmires. That said, while American foreign policy is often deeply controversial, America is also kind of like Japan in that it exercises a great deal of what they call soft power through its culture. American movies and TV shows and music are generally all very high quality, and this is one of America's great aces in the hole for building up international goodwill. America has the biggest population in the G7, and it is also the most diverse, full of literally every kind of person on Earth. This makes it an extremely complicated democracy.